Jung's most transformative insight wasn't just about empathy, but about the dangerous path sensitive people must walk if they want to rise beyond victimhood. He saw that many empaths are born with a wound, but within that wound lies the seed of their greatest strength. This is why Jung often described the journey from wounded to warrior as one of the most radical transformations a human being could undergo. He noted that those who embraced individuation and shadow work could turn their pain into power, while those who resisted would become prisoners of their own sensitivity. Jung called this the alchemical process, the point where suffering either destroys a person or remakes them into something stronger than they ever imagined. What makes this process so striking is that it's not just about personal healing. It reflects what Jung believed was humanity's core psychological mission, turning unconscious suffering into conscious strength. And perhaps nowhere did he see this more vividly than in the case of one of his most famous patients, a person who could heal others but refused to heal themselves. Jung wrote extensively in his notes about this paradox, the healer who could ease the pain of others while secretly drowning in their own. The patient clung to their wounds as if they were sacred. They feared that if they healed, they would lose the very gift that made them valuable, the ability to connect with others through suffering. Jung was stunned to find that this person had made their trauma into an identity. Their wound was not just pain, it was their personality, their meaning, and their sense of purpose. This is what Jung later described as wound identification, the unconscious belief that being broken makes you special. In his journals, he remarked that these individuals often mistake their victimhood for virtue, their pain for purpose, and their weakness for sensitivity. They fear that healing will strip them of their uniqueness, leaving them ordinary and disconnected. Jung found this pattern everywhere. His notes are filled with stories of sensitive patients who unconsciously resisted growth, sabotaged progress, and returned again and again to the comfort of their suffering. He explained that many empaths develop what he called wound attachment syndrome, where their pain becomes indispensable to their self-image. They cling to it because, without it, they don't know who they are. And Jung identified 3 forces that keep this wounded identity alive. The first is shadow rejection and false light. Many empaths see themselves as purely loving, kind, and selfless, but this is only half the truth. In his writings, Jung warned that they project anger, selfishness, and personal power onto others while denying it in themselves. He noticed they feared their own strength, associating it with the very people who had once hurt them. For them, to embrace power was to risk becoming an oppressor. This splitting kept them fragile, unable to integrate into wholeness. The second force is suffering as currency. Jung noted how pain can become a kind of psychological economy. Sympathy, identity, even a sense of superiority. These are all payments that flow to the wounded. In one notebook entry, he wrote about a patient who constantly compared their suffering to others, turning trauma into a badge of moral authority. Healing, in such cases, wasn't appealing. It felt like bankruptcy. The third force is what Jung described as identity terror. For many empaths, the thought of healing feels like death itself. He called this ego death panic, the dread of not knowing who you are without your wounds. Jung observed that their entire life, relationships, beliefs, even their sense of purpose, had been built around pain. Removing it left them with nothing familiar to hold on to. This is why Jung described healing as a threat, not a promise. To integrate the shadow meant stepping into an unknown self, one that was both powerful and untested. It required abandoning the false safety of victimhood. He noted how some empaths would rather cling to helplessness because it was a known prison, whereas empowerment meant walking into a terrifying wilderness. In his patient notes, Jung went further, describing how this resistance turns into what he called an addiction to powerlessness. He saw that powerlessness offers certain unconscious benefits. For example, it can shield a person from responsibility. One patient admitted they avoided career goals and relationships because "I am too broken." That brokenness became an excuse, a shield from criticism and failure. For Jung, this was the most dangerous comfort zone, a soft trap where people rot quietly. He also described how powerlessness could be used as a weapon. By remaining weak, empaths could manipulate others into offering care, sympathy, or rescue. This is what Jung referred to as inverse power, controlling others not through strength, but through weakness. His notes warned that this pattern, though subtle, can become just as manipulative as outright domination. Perhaps most troubling to Jung was what he called suffering narcissism. He noticed how some patients wore their pain like a crown, claiming higher morality or spiritual sensitivity because of it. Their trauma became a source of superiority, preventing real growth. Healing felt like losing status, not gaining strength. And beneath all of this was a deep fear, the fear of becoming the oppressor. Jung's notes reveal how many empaths equated power with cruelty. They remembered those who had hurt them and unconsciously decided that to be strong was to become evil. So, they stayed small, confusing weakness with goodness. Jung repeatedly emphasized that recognizing these patterns was not about blaming the individual, but about unmasking the unconscious forces that keep them trapped. He saw it as a kind of psychological hypnosis. The person believes they are fragile, yet within them is extraordinary potential waiting to be integrated. From these observations, Jung began sketching out what he called the empath's stages of evolution. In his writings, he described 4 levels of development that sensitive individuals must pass through. Stage 1 is the unconscious absorber. At this level, sensitivity feels like a curse. The empath absorbs emotions like a sponge, constantly overwhelmed and drained. Jung noted how these individuals often attract toxic situations and people because they unconsciously seek confirmation of their victim identity. Everything becomes proof of their powerlessness. Stage 2 is the wounded helper. Here, empaths begin using their pain to guide and support others. They become insightful advisors, compassionate listeners, even healers in their own right. But they remain trapped because they see their wound as the source of their gift. Healing feels dangerous. They fear losing their edge. Stage 3 is the shadow integrator. At this level, empaths begin reclaiming their suppressed qualities, anger, selfishness, and personal power. Jung described this stage as terrifying. Many patients feared they were becoming monsters, confusing healthy assertiveness with aggression. But he insisted that integration is not corruption, it's completion. To reject the shadow is to remain half human. Stage 4 is the integrated warrior. This is the culmination where empathy and strength merge. Jung believed this stage represented the highest form of human development. Integrated warriors maintain their sensitivity, but with unshakable boundaries. They can feel deeply without drowning, help others without sacrificing themselves, and stand strong without becoming cruel. In Jung's view, these individuals embody conscious empathy, the fusion of heart and backbone. But Jung warned that the road between these stages is dangerous. He described it as one of the most treacherous psychological journeys a human can make. In his notes, he identified several hazards. The first is identity annihilation, the terror of losing the self you've always known. He wrote of patients who fell into deep depression, even psychosis, when they tried to shed their wounded identity too quickly. The second is what he called the relationship apocalypse. When an empath begins healing, those around them often resist. Friends and family who were comfortable with the old, wounded version may feel threatened by the new boundaries. Jung noted that these relationships can turn hostile, manipulative, or simply fall apart, leaving the empath isolated during their most vulnerable time. The third is shadow terror. When long-buried emotions, like rage or selfishness, surface, the empath may panic, believing they are turning into their abusers. Jung warned that this moral confusion can drive people to suppress their shadow again rather than face it fully. And the fourth hazard is the spiritual bypass trap. Jung observed how many sensitive individuals tried to skip the painful work of integration by hiding behind love and light. They sought transcendence without transformation, floating above their pain instead of digging deep into it. But beneath the surface, the wounds remained, waiting, ready to erupt under stress. For Jung, avoiding these traps required deliberate practices. He created what he called shadow engagement protocols, exercises to reclaim disowned parts of the self. These included paying attention to dreams, exploring projections onto others, and practicing safe expressions of suppressed feelings. The goal was never to glorify darkness, but to become whole. And he emphasized boundary work. He wrote about teaching patients to say no without guilt, to separate their emotions from others, and to distinguish between healthy filters and unhealthy walls. Jung insisted that true empathy is impossible without boundaries, because unprotected sensitivity always collapses into resentment and burnout. In his later notes, he also described what he called authentic power development. This meant learning to assert needs openly rather than manipulating through weakness. It meant taking responsibility, speaking truth, and embracing leadership roles when appropriate. For Jung, real power was not domination, but sovereignty, strength in service of both self and others. This, he believed, was the essence of transformation, moving from victim to warrior, from fragmented to whole. If you've ever felt strangely attached to your wounds, if you've feared that healing would make you lose yourself, Jung's work suggests the opposite is true. Healing does not erase your gift, it amplifies it. Your wounds are not meant to be cages, they are meant to be teachers. If you're beginning to see your sensitivity as both a burden and a gift, comment below. I'm ready to rise beyond the shadow. Jung's fascination with the wounded to warrior transformation didn't stop with individual patients. He began noticing repeating patterns, not only in therapy rooms, but across communities and cultures. In his notes, he wrote that the empath's journey is not just personal, it's archetypal. Every society needs people who can turn pain into wisdom. Otherwise, collective trauma remains unresolved. He saw empaths as carriers of humanity's shadow. And when they integrated it, they didn't just heal themselves. They modeled healing for others. This is why Jung described the empath's rise as both unstoppable and perilous. For every story of transformation, he recorded cases of collapse. Some individuals, he observed, became what he called professional victims. They turned their suffering into an identity so strong, it became their livelihood, their relationships, their entire life. Jung warned that this path traps people in endless cycles of pain because healing would mean losing their very sense of self. He noted, they may help others, but from their wounds rather than from wholeness, creating dependency instead of empowerment. So, what separates those who transform from those who remain stuck? Jung identified 3 decisive elements. First, the willingness to take responsibility for healing rather than waiting for external rescue. Second, the ability to see wounds as teachers rather than permanent identity markers. And third, the courage to risk losing victim status in exchange for authentic empowerment. He called this psychological heroism, the bravery to walk into the unknown self. To support this transformation, Jung recommended building what he called warrior networks. These were relationships that encouraged growth instead of reinforcing wounded patterns. He noticed that many empaths remained trapped because they surrounded themselves with people who benefited from their self-sacrifice. But when empaths connected with what Jung termed growth catalysts, people who celebrated boundaries, encouraged strength, and modeled integrated sensitivity, they found the courage to change. He also warned against wound bonding, relationships based on shared trauma. They felt intimate, but often prevented growth because healing by one partner threatened the identity of the other. Jung envisioned transformation communities, groups where sensitivity was honored but not idolized, and strength was cultivated without cruelty. He believed therapy, creative groups, and even spiritual communities could serve this role, provided they emphasized integration rather than bypassing. Above all, he urged empaths to find mentors, people who had walked the path and proven that sensitivity and strength could coexist. In his journals, Jung outlined what he called the 5-phase evolution process, a more detailed map of how empaths rise from wounded to warrior. Phase 1, pain recognition without purpose. At this stage, the empath finally admits they're suffering but hasn't yet discovered its meaning. Jung noted this often feels worse than denial because pain floods in with no framework for transformation. The breakthrough comes when the empath stops seeing sensitivity as punishment and starts seeing it as guidance. Phase 2, shadow confrontation and integration. This is where the real work begins. The empath faces suppressed anger, rejected selfishness, and denied power. Jung observed how terrifying this was for his patients. Some feared they were becoming cruel simply because they allowed themselves to feel anger. Integration here means learning the difference between aggression and healthy assertiveness. Jung insisted that true empathy is impossible without shadow integration, because otherwise, empaths project their darkness onto others. Phase 3. Boundary construction and testing. Here, empaths begin drawing lines, saying no, protecting their energy, and refusing to be drained. Jung noted how this triggered backlash from others, especially those used to unlimited access. He described this stage as the crucible, where many empaths falter, mistaking other people's disappointment for proof they are bad. Growth accelerates when they learn to tolerate disapproval without abandoning themselves. Phase 4. Power reclamation and purpose discovery. In this stage, empaths reclaim their authentic strength. They begin pursuing personal goals, voicing their truth, and stepping into leadership roles. Jung described how their sensitivity becomes an asset rather than a burden, guiding them toward service that feels empowering instead of depleting. Phase 5. Warrior integration and service. At this level, the empath embodies what Jung called conscious empathy. They can feel deeply without being consumed, help without sacrificing themselves, and balance compassion with strength. These integrated warriors often become healers, leaders, or cultural pioneers, living proof that wounds can become wisdom. Jung also documented the traps that derail transformation. He warned against spiritual bypassing, using meditation, positive affirmations, or forgiveness as shortcuts to avoid shadow work. He called this pseudo-transcendence, a fragile illusion of healing that collapses under stress. Another trap was the victim-to-perpetrator swing, when empaths overcorrect and adopt aggression as a form of defense. He insisted that empowerment without compassion is just another mask for fear. He also described the healing superiority complex, where some empaths, midway through transformation, began looking down on others, still trapped in victim patterns. This inflated sense of achievement stalled their growth because it repeated the old superiority-inferiority dynamic, just with reversed roles. Jung stressed that true integration includes humility, the recognition that healing is ongoing. And then there was the isolation safety trap. Some empaths, terrified of being drained again, withdrew completely from relationships. Jung acknowledged that solitude was sometimes necessary, but warned against mistaking it for transformation. Real growth requires practicing boundaries in real relationships, not just avoiding them. At the cultural level, Jung believed integrated empaths played a revolutionary role. He saw them as relationship pioneers, showing that intimacy doesn't require sacrifice, and that boundaries enhance rather than diminish love. He noted how these warriors often led communities through collective trauma, guiding people without being overwhelmed by mass suffering. In his writings, Jung connected this to humanity's psychological evolution. Each empath who completed the wounded-to-warrior journey added to the collective pool of wisdom. They proved that sensitivity and strength are not opposites, but partners. In one of his most famous reflections, Jung wrote that the most effective healers are those who have transformed their own wounds into wisdom. Their authority doesn't come from being unbroken, but from being broken and remade. They embody the truth that empathy without strength drowns, and strength without empathy destroys. Only together do they create wholeness. For Jung, The empath's rise was unstoppable because it wasn't a choice. It was the psyche's natural movement toward integration. The shadow demands recognition. The self demands wholeness, and sensitivity demands protection through strength. He believed this process was humanity's highest calling, to turn pain into wisdom, wounds into power, and suffering into conscious service. And so, the empath's greatest weakness becomes their greatest strength. They discover that their sensitivity was never the problem. The problem was the lack of integration. Once they integrate, they stand as warriors, able to feel the world's pain without drowning in it, able to offer compassion without erasing themselves. If you're ready to transform your wounds into wisdom, to walk the path from victim to warrior, comment below, "I choose warrior over victim." Because in Jung's vision, your personal transformation isn't just about you. It's part of humanity's evolution toward a more conscious, integrated future. And that rise is unstoppable. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next dimension.